Minorities are always at risk.
Demonization eventually will lead to genocide.
We've seen the backlash against Muslims again and again.
Well-known hate monks giving a very provocative speech against the Muslims.
Say that the Rwandan Genocide, which happened in 1994, actually started 100 years before. United Nations has a charter that could stop a lot of the conflicts that are taking place. Why are they not putting it into practice? Because somebody always says no. Muslim businesses have been targeted. Why did they do that? Because they want to reduce the economic power of the Muslim community. People of Sri Lanka, the majority, should stop and think.
Hello, welcome to the second program on WhatsApp program series conducted by the People's Rights Group based in London. Today will be discussing a very important subject of relevance to the world at large today, that being politics of demonization, as dangerous as ever. And we'll be taking the example of the Rwandan Genocide. To discuss this today in our studio, we have with us Mr. Victor Koroma, and he is the General Manager of the Acre, which is based in Reading in Berkshire in UK, and he is the General Manager for Alliance for Cohesion and Racial Equality. Of course, Victor has a long connection with his working for the cause of human rights in UK, and besides being even in his role as the general manager as well as in his private capacity, he has been very much involved in espousing the cause of human rights in UK, and he has been a strong opponent of human rights in speaking up for the rights of the minorities in UK, mostly working against or to bring relief for the victims of racial inequality and racism. So before I turn to Victor, I would like to put in perspective some of the background issues to this subject which we are going to discuss today. As you know, this 72 years ago in 1948, we had this United Nations being formed, and also the promulgation of a very important document in human rights history, that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So unfortunately, we had, after 72 years, there's still a lot of, things that are going on, human rights issues, and most of the majority of mankind has not been able to enjoy the fruits of human rights at the grassroots level. Of course, there were no World War II, world wars in the world, but there had been always a lot of other issues which actually was concerned the people who actually promulgated this important Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There have been a lot of genocides, and even today we have a wave of populism that is blowing across the world, even the developed world like US and Europe, and including UK as well, where the racism has been used by the politicians to either gain power or both gain power and to stay in power as well. So in this dirty political game, we have seen the demonization of communities being part of their strategy, political strategy, and we have seen politicians using the us versus them rhetoric and playing divisive politics for political ends, towards political ends. So this demonization is a very, very dangerous strategy which has been dividing communities today, and we have the racism all over, including US, UK, and also in many parts of Asia, including Sri Lanka as well. So we are going to discuss today the politics of demonization, how it can lead to very, very serious consequences, including genocide. So, Victor, thank you very much for joining us today, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you. Today, we are going to discuss about this subject. I want to ask you the background. Now, today we see this. I mentioned about 72 years ago we had this one, and the world said enough is enough to war. Of course, there was no war, but there have been a lot of other things that which has been besetting the world until today. So, as you still know, there is a wave of populism blowing across. In your view, as a human rights activist, what do you think? What is the impact of this type of populism waves on the minorities, especially today?
Thank you, Brother Lukman, for the introduction and for inviting me to this discussion. Before I give my answer, maybe I need to put a little bit of context into what I do. I am the manager, as you said, of the Alliance for Cohesion and Racial Equality in Reading. And Reading happens to be one of the most diverse towns in the United Kingdom, and probably the most diverse south of London, going down the M4 corridor. The history of the town being a market town, the university having a world-renowned university, and lately having the big multinational corporations setting up their headquarters or a branch office here in the Berkshire, Reading Berkshire area, has meant the population of the town is now even more diverse than it ever was. And what we do is to try to work with different communities to find a balance on how we can live together peacefully in a shared environment. So we advocate on behalf of rights of minority groups. We support all minority causes, and we support individuals who are victims of racism, racial harassment, discrimination, or racial violence. In doing this, we work closely with the authorities, meaning Reading Borough Council and Thames Valley Police. Now, you make an important point about 75 years ago, the international community said, "Oh, never again." But since then, we've seen repeated acts of genocide right across the world, and it is true that in the terms of balance of power, minorities are always at risk where there is populist political practices being encouraged, being engendered, being propagated, as we've seen in recent times. And what I usually say in my line of work, especially when I'm talking to the political class, is that they should be careful about the words that they use. They should be careful about the ideas that they put out in the public domain, because there are a lot of people who are waiting for legitimacy. And when a populist politician stands up and says something that appeals to somebody's basest nature, then in truth, you, the politician, are just as guilty as that person were there to act on that negative comment that you've discussed, you've espoused, and you're now saying has been taken out of context. No, you have as a political leader, you have a responsibility to be careful about how you deal with your population, and you have to be even more careful not to put the minorities within your population at risk, because where there are minorities and you're playing a political game, the majority would always see it as you justifying whatever they do.
Thank you, Victor. I mean, that actually put things in perspective. In fact, the impact of that types of populism on the minorities, we have seen together. We have been working together on this type of causes in UK. Now one of the questions that will arise from your response is that the problem of demonization, right? One of the worst things that can happen to a community is they have been treated less human than the others, which is a very much cunning political strategy used to, you know, to stay in power by some of these disgruntled politicians. Now, if you look at this demonization of communities, now, especially in terms of its impact on these communities, the demonization, now the history has shown us that it has led to, you know, very much disastrous consequences. So why do you think the world is still not learning lessons, right? If history is anything to be going by, we know the consequences. So why is people not, you know, learning lessons out of this?
You see, Brother Lukman, politics has a funny way of establishing itself, and when a politician, like I said, when a politician uses divisive language, they're working towards a particular purpose. It's never by accident. I don't believe it is by accident. I don't believe that things are taken out of context. They really want to generate a discussion, a reaction of sorts, which is why they make divisive statements. But I think if we want to look at the demonization of a people and how it's impacted them, we have a reference point where we can start from. Yes, incidents had been taking place before, you know, World War II. But if you look at what happened in Germany from 1933 onwards, you can see how it was a process, a well thought out process of, first of all, you know, blaming a group of people, which is the Jews, who were integrated in Germany, who had made positive contributions to the society, but they just happened to be in the minority. And those that were in power had a problem with them. So they started off by marginalizing them, not getting them, you know, throwing them out of society life. Then it came to blaming them, that they were the cause of the country's economic and political woes. Then it came to you know, actually attacking them, you know, using language that reduced their status as human beings. You know, in the past you've had, you know, populist politicians making reference to minorities as cockroaches, as rats, as being infested, as being overrun, you know, as if these were people who were less than human beings. And that discourse, like I said, does appeal to a group of people. Usually they start small and they do something and get away with it, then you know, many more will follow because they're not seeing any reaction from the authorities. And the reaction is not seen because that is exactly what the authorities wanted to happen in them putting forward their ideas, in them putting that blame on that minority community. And, you know, and in Nazi Germany, we saw that grow from, you know, Kristallnacht, where they attacked Jewish businesses and brought them to the ground, synagogues. We had the burning of Jewish books and literature, because in effect they were saying there's no contribution, you know, no positive contribution that you can make to our society. But they had been doing that for hundreds of years before 1933. So how all of a sudden, if it was not for political purposes, has the Jewish literature become poisonous to the German people? You know, and within that context, you had Jewish scientists, you had Jewish musicians, you had Jewish, everybody making a positive contribution to the society. But as soon as you inject that hate speech into your discourse, what you're doing is eroding the foundations of society. Because you suddenly said there are some people who are more equal within a society than others, and those that are not worthy of being part of that whole that you have created should then be exterminated, should then be eliminated. Several words have been used, and none more so to describe those actions as the Holocaust and genocides.
Yeah, Victor, I think what you said is striking a chord, both in UK as well as where we hail from, Sri Lanka, where we have these types of demonization to achieve a set political objective. But as we were discussing this subject in terms of greater consequences, this demonization is going to lead to lots of consequences. And in fact, the Genocide Watch, one of the documents they produced, also said that demonization eventually will lead to genocide. Maybe not in 1 year, 2 years, but maybe in a century. Now, how can that happen actually? Because as a layman, right, listening to this, so we are just demonization and we have short-term objectives. But will that be sort of a tiger's tail where you won't be able to let go until the people, have mutual suspicions about with their sister communities living with them for centuries. Now, how can that happen? From demonization to a thing as grave as genocide.
Process of desensitizing a population and marginalizing a community to the extent that it results in genocide. It's a process. It's a gradual process, sociologists have produced, various documents, various models. But one of the simple ones is the pyramid of hate, where you start off by avoidance. You avoid the group of people, then you use language. You start denigrating their culture. You use language that is not complementary to them. It's subtle messages. Look at the way they dress. Look at the food they eat. Look at even their music. We suddenly had, particularly during colonization, we had this thing between the natives and the civilized. But those natives have been living under a system which was disrupted by colonization. And they were getting along until somebody interfered in that continuum and created a division within people. And suddenly, even within our countries, you suddenly have people who are seen as a majority and who are seen as a minority. It wasn't that way until somebody decided to draw a line through nations to say, well, we're creating this country or that country. And the result of that is that those that are in majority obviously have the balance of power by sheer force of numbers. And those that are in the majority are expected to just get on with it. And and gradually you start moving from the hates, from the the casual speech of dismissal speech to hate speech. You start focusing on those people in a very negative way. There's nothing that they can do that that would be accepted by the majority. And you then, from that stage, you go to the next stage, which is the attacks. You've so put those people in a box that anybody associating with them is seen as an enemy of the people. We've had that language used. We've had, particularly even here in the UK, which is saying it is a positive democratic society. We've seen the backlash against Muslims again and again. It only takes for one Muslim person or somebody that identified themselves as being Muslim, who by every stretch of the imagination is not following the precepts of the religion, yet every Muslim is put in that box and they're insulted, they're denigrated, they're attacked, they're abused. So you then create that atmosphere. And once you start attacking them, physical attacks, well, what's to stop you from killing people? Especially, and this is the important point. Politicians, leaders might say, oh, well, I didn't do it. I didn't ask anybody to attack anybody. But when you use the language that they then, in being impressionable, interpret as you not appreciating the presence of that group of people within your society, what would they do? Try to eliminate them. And that elimination, whatever you describe it, is genocide. It is what you call genocide.
Victor, that's fantastic. Actually, we are coming to grips with an example that we are going to shortly discuss. Now, I can relate to what's happening back in Sri Lanka. You know, in 2014, when this infamous, anti-Muslim violence started, and which actually led to a change of the government as well in power that time, was one of the well-known hate monks giving a very provocative speech against the Muslims. And that started a wave of all this violence. So it's not just one person can say no, I didn't mean to do this, but when you do it in a public forum and provoking the set of people, what they do is they are responsible for the consequences. So coming back to the world at large now, as we saw, a lot of genocides. We have a Bosnian one, Cambodia and Kampuchea. We had, and now we are going to discuss a very important genocide, where the demonization started off with demonization and led to the worst possible form of genocide. That was in Rwanda.
That's right.
Now, being of African heritage, you have studied lots of other types of crisis in that part of the world, and the Rwandan genocide has a lesson for the future, right? For those people who are attempting. Unfortunately, still it's being repeated in small measures, small doses, and which we don't understand the evil consequences. So coming back to Rwanda, how do you think this started actually? Now we talk of genocide, but did it happen like flash in a pan, or it's just something of a historic development?
In history, particularly in modern history, we've seen cataclysmic change in the political structure resulting in genocides. If you look at the disintegration of Yugoslavia, that gave rise to nationalist sentiments, which it's another word for populist, it's another word for negative politics, because it never is good. It is using your power as the majority to suppress the minority, and sometimes it can take a long time for that hatred to be developed to the stage where it results in genocide. And Rwanda is a perfect case study. It's a perfect case study because I can categorically say that the Rwanda Genocide, which happened in 1994, actually started 100 years before. And I researched the timeline for that, which resulted in that incident which shocked the world in those 90 days. Rwanda is one of those societies where it is made up of the same people. You hear the terminology being used, Hutu or Tutsi, but in truth, they are the same people. It's just that categorization came from their relative professions. The Hutu being farmers, and the Tutsis being, they control the cattle and the arms and the military. Going back historically, they form the protective part of their community. So they have the same religion, they all come the same, but Banyarwanda nationality, so they're not different people. And so you ask yourself, well, how did this come about? And which is why I have stretched the timeline back to 100 years. Because in 1894, Germany occupied what was then, the East African Bantu region. And whilst they were there, they knew that they were colonialists are always the minority within that community. What they have are arms and a lot of what do you call it, deception and guile to able to make to realize their wish. So what they then did was to work with the Tutsi king to say, well, we'll put you in power, we'll maintain you, we'll provide arms and ammunition to protect you, but in return you should support us. Okay? So that was how they, the colonialists were able to gain ground in not only Africa, not only Rwanda, but right across the world. You go India, you go Sri Lanka, you go, wherever it is that was colonized. That was how they used the people. And usually they take minority people and put them in the leadership and say, well, we will protect you. And with the power of force that they come with, the guns and trade and bribery and corruption, they're able to control the nation. So we moved to 1910, where there were border changes, because part of Rwanda, Burundi were all part of this Bantu nation that also included, Tanzania. Then came the war, the First World War. Well, just before, during the First World War, 1916, the Germans lost territory to Belgium, and Belgium took over control. Well, we know how Belgium ruled. If you look at what they did in Congo, they not only brutalized the people, they also stole the wealth of the people, and so they brought that same policy into Rwanda, Burundi. So the border changes meant you now had an independent Rwanda and Burundi, with Rwanda having majority Tutsis, and Hutus, and minority Tutsis who were in the leadership. Then you look across to Burundi, who are the opposite, and I remember when I was growing up, my dad gave me a transistor radio for my 12th birthday to say, and the only station of repute that you listened to then were either Voice of America or BBC. But for us who grew up under British colonialism, BBC was our first port of call. And during the 60s, you had, it was always about this Tutsi and Hutu thing in Rwanda and Burundi. Then in 1930s, Belgium now being in control, they brought forward identity cards, which then showed the demarcation, that you were Hutu and you were a Tutsi, and that card allowed you to access certain services and exercise certain rights. So you can see how the people were now being separated. They were one people, but now they were being identified by their profession as if that was their origin, their ethnic origin. Okay, it was the ID cards that were introduced by Belgium in the 1930s, and the process of segregation was very, very simple. If you owned 10 heads of cattle or more, you became a Tutsi. You were pushed into the ruling class. If you had businesses, if you were wealthy, you suddenly became a Tutsi. If you were poor, you became a Hutu. So you can see what that does is to build resentment in those that were now being treated as second-class citizens. So we moved to post-World War II. The exploitation of Rwanda continued. There was no economic development. Even that which was available, privileges which were available, were given to the minority Tutsis, and that just built on the resentment of the Hutus. Yeah, and in the 1940s, the Hutus fled en masse from Rwanda. because with colonization, and if you take the track record of Belgium in Congo and Africa in general, they were a very, very brutal regime. They were very, very brutal regime. Amputations, they introduced that as part of their colonial rule. Slaughtering whole families, whole communities, just so as to subdue the people was a tool that they introduced. So the Hutus, seeing that death was coming, fled to Uganda. In the 1950s, they started organizing opposition to the minority Tutsi king, yeah? And gradually, the Tutsis also spurred by African nationalism, because everybody, this was post-war, they were now clamoring for, for independence. So they started, forming themselves, organizing their groups. 1961, Rwanda gained independence with a majority Hutu population and a minority Tutsi leadership. The opposite, like I said, happened in Burundi. And so in Rwanda, they started encouraging an anti-violent, the Hutu started encouraging an anti-violent, a violent anti-Tutsi narrative. Even though they were in power, they were in the majority. And this was done by Belgium in order to deflect the economic mismanagement of the country. So now the start was they were with the Tutsis to suppress the Hutus, but now because they see the Hutus coming up in numbers and being, very, very adept in their opposition, the Belgian authorities switched over and started supporting the Hutus and encouraging violence against the Tutsis. And within that came all sorts of, the negative language. There were, if you were a Tutsi, you were considered a cockroach or a rat. And what did cockroaches and rats do? They are infestations. They come in, they don't come in to make, they come to destroy. They come to make a place filthy. They come to make a place unhygienic. So you can see that sort of ideology being built in the minds of people. So we move fast forward to 1973. There was a military coup, the Tutsi king was deposed, and General Habyarimana took over. And he brought in a brutal repression of the Tutsis. So what had been started back in the 50s suddenly started coming to fruition, that the Tutsis were now being attacked constantly, being marginalized from privileges. And the economic decline obviously continued, and the repression, this General Habyarimana repressed the opposition, not only within the Hutus, but also in the Tutsi population. So what happened was, in exile, the Tutsi and Hutu exiles formed the Rwanda Patriotic Front, which then started, border skirmishes with the Habyarimana government forces, which, like I said, in the late 60s, early 70s, when I was giving my transistor radio, I would tune into BBC, and they had a panorama program, which was focused on Africa. And it is this conflict. I started hearing this conflict and the brutality of the conflict from way back then. So they then, again, what happened was a colonial power intervened again, France. Yeah? And what France did was to train the Hutu army in the pretext that they would repel this Rwanda Patriotic Front. But in truth, they were putting themselves as a favored candidate for the mineral resources of Rwanda, of the resources, the natural resources of Rwanda. So France started training Habyarimana's troops, and within a space of a year, that army grew from 5,000 to over 30,000. well armed, well trained, with modern weapons. But you can't put good people down. That's the sad thing. So the Rwanda Patriotic Front, we're now gaining ground, and we're coming in. So what weaponry was used against the Tutsis that were there was increased repression, using hate speech to galvanize the majority community to attack the minority Tutsis at the time. And that all came to a head in 1994, 100 years after colonialism interfered. And what happened in 94, Habyarimana, pushed to the corner, decided, via the African Union, to sign a peace accord with the Rwanda Patriotic Front. And on returning from Arusha in Tanzania, where the accord had been signed to Rwanda, his plane was shot down. Yeah? And that unleashed the genocide because preparation had been made. Suddenly everybody, the poor farmers who didn't have the tools to do the work, had machetes. Farmers had guns and ammunition. So all this had been prepared beforehand. All this had been distributed to them. And this incident was the catalyst that created the Rwanda genocide explosion. But the jury is still out as to who shot the plane down. Whether it was the Rwanda Patriotic Front who had gained, a major victory in getting him to the table to sign a peace accord, or opposition within Habyarimana's own government who were aggrieved that he had given so much ground to the RPF. So that jury is still out, but the whole world knows. I don't want to recount that history, but we all know in those 90 days the brutality with which the minority within the Rwanda community were dealt with. Yeah. And the international community had to beat their breasts in shame because they could have stopped it, but they took so long to intervene that so many people lost their lives. We've seen it happen. We've seen it happen in Bosnia. We've seen it happen in places all over the world. Cambodia. We've seen it happen in Ethiopia. We've seen it happen in Sudan. We are seeing it happening in Sri Lanka. We've seen it happen. It's just keep going on and on. It's now happening in South America as well. Brazil is actively putting down its minority population for its own selfish ends.
Okay, that was a very horrible episode that you related. One of the takes from that is that genocide is not something which happens like a flash in the pan exercise. It has been, the background has been already built. And you said for Rwandan genocide it's about more than a century. So that was a wrong time. So in terms of that genocide, if you take example, why was the international community silent on that? And was it because the organizations like UN is apathetic and they were not very effective, or is it because of the public activism, not being very effective enough?
I am always suspicious of this term international community, because in truth they're just there for themselves, for their benefit. If something doesn't benefit them, they're not interested. And if something benefits them, even though from an active perspective, they would look the other way. And the flaw of when we say international community, we're talking principally at major blocks like the United Nations. We're talking about major blocks like the European Union. When the Soviet bloc was there was that as well. Well, what was their major trade with the rest of the world? Arms and ammunition. That was always the biggest trade for them. So when these internal skirmishes begin, they look the other way, because they know their arms are going to be sold. Their arms are going to fuel the atrocities that will be there. We've had Britain say categorically that if they did not sell arms, somebody else would, so they might as well participate in that. You know, and when you look at the repressive regimes, what weaponry do they use? If you're saying they're using water cannons, who makes the water cannons? It is the wealthy Western countries. That is, who makes the tear gas? It is who makes the guns? Who makes the, I mean, you know, the bullets and whatever? It is them. And they have so cornered the market that you cannot produce your own weaponry. They would attack you, you know. And when you say international community, the flaw of particularly the United Nations and why they're so important is the fact that, believe me, even though there are 200 plus nations within the United Nations, the balance of power rests with just 5 of them, the permanent members of the Security Council. Nothing moves if they don't say yes to it. Okay, so let's take Rwanda, the genocide that happened. United Nations, France had forces in there to protect the Hutu leadership, not to prevent the genocide of the Tutsis. The United Nations had troops in there, and what did they do? They pulled them out of Rwanda at the behest of France, who's a, you know, well, it's speculated that it's at the behest of France because they wanted to protect their interests. They wanted to be seen as the power brokers, you know, and that is what commentators have referred to as to why France was there and they didn't do anything to stop the genocide. So wherever there are skirmishes like this, and I remember when the Darfur genocide was taking place in Sudan. I remember, you know, a top Labour politician coming to Reading, and I asked her, I said, look, I have seen, you know, your government intervene in fights that they did not have to get into. I've seen them intervene in fights that they have a vested interest in. Because if you take Iraq, we did not have any reason to go into Iraq, but yet we were gung-ho and gone happy to go in there. If you take Sierra Leone, and I even though you can use this from a critical point of view, but in truth, why were they there? Because we have the diamond mines, and the diamond mines, the royal, the crown estates has an interest in the mines in Sierra Leone. Britain, as a government, has an interest in the mine. De Beers, for which I understand Britain has, you know, a large stake in De Beers, the diamond mining, the diamond conglomerate, had a stake in there, and that was being taken away. So it's that vested interest that some people say got them involved. I am happy that they in their intervention meant the war stopped. But then put that to one side and look for what was the motive. And oftentimes the motive is a vested interest. If they don't intervene, well, it probably is not serving their purpose. If they do, it is because of that. United Nations has a charter that could stop a lot of the conflicts that are taking place. Why are they not putting it into practice? Because somebody always says no to that. You know? Yes,
so from what you said, I think international community, the word international community itself is a misnomer. I mean, it's not an international community as such. What you say is that it boils down to the members of the Security Council, the 6 powers who control the world. And the name of the game is you always self-interest and, you know, selling of their arms and various other economic interests. So from that point of view, I think I mean, I can relate that to what's happened in Sri Lanka as well. You know, since 1948 we had a lot of, you know, the racial skirmishes, you know, tensions were there, all bent on self-interest. You know, there's majoritarianism was there, everything was held-built to, you know, keep a certain clique in power, and that has been continuing. And to today in you know, the 2009 the war ended in Sri Lanka between two communities. There was a lot of issues were there, and then there was another community became a scapegoat to, because the war ended, there was no issue as such, and another issue has to be invented, and that's why the so-called the anti-Muslim the violence or the hate came into being. Islamophobia actually was used in good measure to build up that anti-Muslim hate and tensions. So what happened after the Easter Sunday strategy, which was this one, and the entire Muslim community was asked to assume collective guilt, which was very unpopular. And from there, what happened now, and the things are the hate is being mainstreamed. So gathering from this, the strategies, what happened in Rwanda. And what's happening all over the world, what are the lessons for us, not just in Sri Lanka, for others as well. How can we prevent this type of mainstream of hate and this one?
I have known you for quite a number of years now, and I have seen, we've discussed, I've seen your writings, and I've read about what is happening in Sri Lanka. And it's not a new phenomenon. The anti-Muslim sentiment has been stoked over a number of years. And for me, that is my fear. If you look at the Rwanda model, that when these things start now, they go in waves, they attack and they withdraw. Things tend to quieten down. The international community makes noises and sends envoys to try to calm things down. And as soon as they leave, 6 months, 1 year later, there's another conflagration, and people get killed. Muslim businesses get destroyed. This, for me, is testing waters, because that is what happened in Rwanda. These the hate attacks, they happen in waves, again and again and again. And the lesson for me, which I dread to, I pray to God that it never happens, is that it builds up to the point where the majority Buddhist population buy into the idea of cleansing the land of Sri Lanka of Muslims. Because that is what brings about genocides. And when hate speeches are not, attacked by the central government, when hate speakers are not brought to book by the governments in those areas, what in effect they're doing is, putting a subliminal message in the population that, what this person is saying is right. That's why we haven't charged them. That's why we haven't arrested them. And even when we arrest them, we just keep them for a day or so. We put them out of bail and we forget about them. And a year down the line, they make even worse speech than that. And you get that process being repeated again and again. And people are impressionable. Populations are increasing. Resources are reducing in real terms. And when you take that combination of people seeing their livelihoods going down, and they see a minority community thrive, because as a minority community, you find protection in your small numbers. You do things together. You support each other in business and in life. And they see you flourishing. They see you as the enemy. And that is when they would attack and try to get rid of you. We've seen that happen where businesses, have been, Sri Lankan businesses, Muslim businesses have been targeted. Why did they do that? Because they want to reduce the economic power of the Muslim community in that society. Even though per capita, it's less than what the majority are producing. But it's just the idea that you're flourishing, that kind of puts them in that mindset that they have to destroy it. Because I think if you ask me, Brother Lukman, the Sri Lanka government can benefit more from protecting the Muslim minority and Muslim businesses by the sheer amount of taxes that the Muslim businesses would pay. And be able to solve their own problems, rather than come out into the West with a cap in hand to beg for grants, loans, and whatever, which are given so many conditionalities that it impacts negatively on the people and the economies of the country. And we've seen that happen again and again. So the lesson for me is that people of Sri Lanka, the majority, should stop and think. A German pastor, Pastor Nimola, produced a poem which says, when they came for the Jews, I did not speak because I was not a Jew. When they came for the socialists, I did not speak because I was not a socialist. And and eventually when they came for me, there was no one left to speak. And when you have dictatorships, because what tends to happen is one dictatorship tends to hand over or be deposed by another dictator. And that dictator would want to settle themselves. They don't want to upset that majority that has already been desensitized to the needs of a minority within their communities. So they carry on the same rhetoric, the same management style, so that they're seen as a stronger man than the last person. And when that happens, year on year on year, as with Rwanda, I hope the people of Sri Lanka can see that they're being manipulated towards a particular goal. And I hope and pray that they do not buy into that ideology, and they do not keep silent, because if they do that, there would come a time when you've taken out so many of the minorities, you start looking for differences even within your own group. Isn't that what happens in life? You start looking for differences within your own group, whether it's regional, whether it's tribal, whether it's some sort of practice that is unique to your group, which is then condemned by the others, and you within the majority suddenly become a minority and you get attacked. So the only way you can stop that is by putting a stop to what is happening now. If the majority population of Sri Lanka honestly need to come out in protest at the way they see their societies being divided along religious lines. Whatever religious principles you follow, the respect for life and livelihood of another human being is paramount, regardless of which religion. And even in humanists, which you can say is irreligious, it is about protecting and respecting your fellow human beings. And that is one of the main precepts of whatever religion you follow in this life. So that, I think, for me, is a lesson that Sri Lanka needs to take about this. These things happen slowly, so don't buy into that hate narrative. As a free-thinking person, see what is right from what is wrong, and start standing by those that are being disadvantaged.
Yeah, thank you very much, Victor. I think we have had a very useful discussion today, and thank you very much for your valuable time and for sharing very, very valuable views. And today we have been discussing on this WhatsApp program that is organized by the People's Rights Group based in London. Today's subject was the politics of demonization as dangerous as ever, the example of the Rwandan genocide, and we discussed today the ill effects of the demonization, which would ultimately lead to evil consequences like even a genocide as well. So drawing lessons from this discussion to Sri Lanka, as Victor rightly stressed and emphasized, is very important that we take lessons out of these types of disasters, where the hate speech or the divisive politics that has been espoused by the politicians, it's very important that the public at large draw lessons from this and avoid mainstreaming of hate within the society. And it's the unity of the people that will eventually lead to allow heal the wounds of war that has been going for so many years. So thank you very much, Victor, for very, very useful discussion, and look forward to more discussions of this nature in the future, and we'll be organizing various discussions of this sort on contemporary human rights issues. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.